The chandelier throws a cold light across the ballroom as my father points at me like I'm a stain on the carpet. His voice is low enough to sound civilized and sharp enough to draw blood. Conversations falter. Bracelets pause mid-clink. A violin note hangs too long in the air. My mother's smile doesn't break, but her eyes do, flicking toward the manager, as if I'm a problem to be folded into the schedule and removed. The waiter near me stills, holding a champagne flute so carefully the bubbles seem afraid to rise. I stand where the parquet meets the carpet, exactly where girls like me were taught never to stand, and feel old rules scraping up from the floorboards. This was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, it's a rehearsal of something I already know too well. The performance matters more than the people. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. And if you've ever been treated like you were out of place in your own family, tap that like button and share this with someone who'll understand. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. But to understand why a single gesture could cut that deep, you have to know the house where those gestures were carved. I grew up in a brick colonial on a quiet cul-de-sac where the lawns matched and the mailboxes were all painted black. Inside, our oak dining table gleamed like a polished stage, and dinner was a nightly press conference. My father is Richard Williams, a man who buys empty lots and sells skylines, who calls himself practical when he's really just immovable. My mother, Eleanor, ran charity galas like military exercises, bouquets marching in straight lines, seating charts heavy with unspoken math. We were not a family, we were a brand. On Sundays, the Lakeside Country Club opened its white doors like a promise. The air inside smelled like lemon oil and expectation. I learned to keep my shoulders back before I learned to parallel park. Posture, Tammy, my father would say, tapping 2 fingers between my shoulder blades as he introduced me to a man whose first name was Dr. Even Off-Duty. Compliment Mrs. Anderson's necklace, my mother would add without looking at me. I began to notice how the room bent itself around the people who had learned the choreography. Heads tilted at the same angle, laughter kept to a reasonable volume, kindness measured like a garnish. Jessica floated through it all with a grace that felt like a rebuke. 3 years younger, she could read a room before she crossed the threshold. She wore soft colors and softer voice tones, the kind of girl who knew which fork meant I belong. At family brunches, she caught my eye sometimes as if to say, "I'm sorry," without saying anything at all. When she laughed at our father's jokes, I tried not to hear the click of a lock turning. I loved a camera and the way it taught me to look. I loved light on a rainy windshield and a boy's freckled hands shaping wet clay on a high school art table. I said this once at dinner, how a photograph could teach you to notice the soul hiding inside ordinary things. My father cut his steak with long, serious strokes and told me real work didn't hide in hobbies. "Your place comes with responsibilities," he said, the words laying out like a contract. He'd already arranged an internship at an investment firm so expensive the reception desk looked like an altar. My mother left catalogs from the right colleges on my quilt like invitations to a life that didn't fit. They called it guidance. It felt like trespass. Sometimes the humiliation was small, the kind you almost miss if you're not looking. A sigh when I ordered the wrong thing, a warning glance when my curiosity drifted into questions that didn't polish anyone's reflection. Sometimes it was public. At a hospital fundraiser, I asked why the donor wall listed names instead of programs. The table went quiet, as if I'd asked why we breathe. My mother filled the silence with a story about generosity. I learned that questions were rude when they knocked at the wrong door. By the time college arrived, the decision was made for me, shaped in conversations I wasn't invited to. I earned a business degree because it was safe, because it matched the upholstery. My camera gathered dust on a shelf while I learned to write emails with words like synergy and pipeline. I studied late in the library, and stared through glass at my own face until the fluorescent lights made the skin under my eyes look blue. The breaking point looked ordinary from the outside. A Tuesday late afternoon light bending gold across our trimmed hedges. My graduation cap sat on the hall table tassel, twisted like an anxious finger. My father stood in the kitchen in shirt-sleeves tie loosened every inch of him, a man who believed the world could be organized according to his will. "You'll start at Williams Development on Monday," he said, setting a leather folder beside the coffee maker. "Project coordinator. We'll put you on the Harbor Ridge build. Great exposure. Great men to learn from." I had rehearsed a kind response that would not sound like a refusal, but my mouth forgot the choreography. "I'm going to launch my own e-commerce business," I said, and even the refrigerator hum felt startled. Artisan pieces from independent makers, ceramics, textiles, small batch items. "I've got a plan." The silence sharpened, then split. My father's face moved through 3 weather systems, confusion heat, and a purple storm I recognized from childhood. "An internet peddler," he said, as if swearing in church. My mother rested a hand on the counter, the diamond in her wedding band catching the late sun like a warning flare. "Darling," she said, kind voice wearing its best pearls, "you can certainly explore that little project after work. Your father has already told everyone at the firm. There are expectations. If love has locks, this is where I heard them click." My father laid it out like a legal brief: accept the job, or lose the car, the cards, the health insurance, and don't expect us to fund foolishness. He reached for we when it suited him, and I when it didn't. My mother called it concern. It sounded like control. I wish I could tell you I delivered a speech that made him rethink everything. But the truth is, I said, "No thank you," the way you decline pie when you're full, and we all pretended for 3 seconds that it wasn't going to change the rest of our lives. Then the yelling started, not loud enough to alarm the neighbors, just loud enough to shatter something inside me that had been holding on. I carried boxes to my car with the quiet determination of someone moving a small nation in the trunk of a used sedan. My father watched from the doorframe and corrected my grip on a lamp, because there is always something to correct. My mother stayed upstairs. I could hear drawers opening and closing, the soft thud of tissue paper and perfume boxes, the soundtrack of a woman organizing grief into shapes she could display. Jessica met me at the bottom of the steps with a folded note. She leaned in the scent of her hair like the high school bathroom before prom. "Call me," she whispered, and her eyes looked older than mine. On the front porch, the light had clicked on against the gathering dark, as if the house itself needed reassurance it was doing the right thing. I turned back twice the way you do when the past still thinks it has a claim. No one waved. It would have ruined the picture. I found a studio across town where the walls were thin and the tub sloped like a smile that had lost its enthusiasm. The landlord handed me the keys with a shrug and a form. The radiator hissed like an irritated cat. I set my lamp on the windowsill and watched the neighbor's porch light blink on, off on. I thought about the country club and the way the chandeliers there never flickered. Back then, injustice didn't look like a courtroom or a headline. It looked like a dinner table where questions were impolite and the only applause came when you recited the lines. It felt like a daughter trimmed to fit her mother's friend group and a father who measured affection in future salary. It tasted like cold coffee at midnight while I taught myself the difference between margins and dreams. And it sounded like silence blank holidays, birthdays that slid past like unmarked exits on a dark highway. I tried to make peace with their story about me, that I was stubborn, ungrateful, difficult. Maybe if I could accept their version, I could live inside it without scraping my knees on every edge. But every time I opened my laptop and sketched a storefront in the margins of a spreadsheet, I remembered the way a lens had once taught me to see. Even when I did everything right by their standards, I felt like a counterfeit bill passing from hand to hand. The last time I visited the club as a guest, before everything, my mother pressed her fingers into my palm and whispered, "Remember who you are," meaning remember who we require you to be. I did remember. I remembered the waitress with the neat braid who thanked the busboy by name. I remembered the groundskeeper's hands rough with summer resting for a minute on the back of a bench to watch the sunset. I remembered the hum of the dishwashers in the kitchen, the rhythm steady and unpretentious. I remembered ordinary people holding the building up. There's a kind of cruelty that doesn't leave bruises. It lives in the way you're told your voice is too loud and then too quiet, your skirt too soft and then too stiff, your dreams too small until they're too big to fit in the room. It's a steadied hand at your elbow that looks like help when it's really steering. It's a life you can live to the end without ever arriving. The night after the ultimatum, rain tapped the window with familiar knuckles, like an uncle who never stops by without calling. I set a chipped mug on the radiator and watched the steam rise. I opened the little velvet box that held a bracelet Jessica had given me for my 18th birthday. The clasp had always stuck. I rubbed my thumb over the engraving until the metal warmed. Somewhere across town, my father was probably reading headlines about interest rates, and my mother was deciding on flowers for luncheon where the napkins would match the shoes. The knowledge hurt less than I expected, and more than I could say out loud. When you've been told your whole life that safety is obedience dressed as love, saying no feels like stepping off the edge of a roof. I hadn't hit bottom yet, and I hadn't learned to fly. I just stood in the middle of that tiny room, listening to the neighbor's television through the wall, and tried to remember how to breathe without asking permission. On my phone, the Lakeside Country Club posted a photo from the ballroom crystal bright carpet, smooth a universe where nothing stained and nothing squeaked. My father stood beside a framed rendering of a new development smile anchored, hand sure. My mother looked elegant in a dress the color of winter sky. Jessica's head tilted toward them, the angle practiced the message clear. My name wasn't in the caption. It didn't have to be. I turned the phone face down on the windowsill and watched the rain thicken a silver curtain between what I'd been and what I might be. Somewhere in the building, a baby cried, a door shut, a dog skittered across linoleum. Life kept happening, uncurated, uninvited, beautifully rude. I made a list on a torn envelope. Things I knew, things I could learn, things I would have to give up to get where I couldn't yet see. The list wasn't noble. It was rent due dates and an extra shift. It was a used camera I could maybe buy next month. It was the name for a store no one had heard of. The radiator clanked and quieted. The rain softened. I carried the lamp from the windowsill to the lone nightstand and tightened the shade until it sat straight. The bulb hummed warm and stubborn. I could hear the club in my head, Silver on China, a song I used to know. I turned off the light and let the room go dark. Outside, a bus sighed to a stop at the corner. Inside, the quiet gathered itself and stretched out across the floor. I stood in it steady for the first time all day and felt the small shift of something uncoiling in my chest. In the morning, the silence would become a weight I'd have to learn to carry. Tonight, it was only a door barely open, waiting for me to decide which way to walk. The first morning in that little apartment came with a sound I'd never heard before, quiet that didn't belong to anyone else. No footsteps above, no voice calling from downstairs, no schedule waiting to be obeyed. Just the faint hiss of the radiator and the tap of rain against a window that stuck halfway open. I made instant coffee in a chipped mug and watched the steam rise like a slow prayer. For the first time in my life, I wasn't performing for anyone. I thought freedom would feel lighter. Instead, it pressed down on my chest like a full suitcase I didn't know how to carry. Rent came due faster than the world was supposed to change. The tiny savings I'd built from part-time jobs shrank with every trip to the grocery store. My business plan was a stack of notebooks covered in ideas I wasn't sure I could afford to try. By the end of that first month, the numbers didn't add up, so I took the only job that would have me a waitress at a diner on the east side open from sunrise to midnight. It wasn't glamorous, but the uniform was clean and the pay came in cash. I told myself it was temporary, that I was learning humility, though some nights it felt more like punishment. The customers were mostly regulars, construction workers, office clerks, truckers passing through. They called me Miss Tammy and left change stacked under their plates. The cook, Frank, had been there 20 years and spoke in short sentences, but he'd slide me an extra muffin at closing with a small nod, which said more than sympathy ever could. I'd walk home past neon storefronts and count tips by streetlight, promising myself that next week would be better. Between shifts, I worked on the website I'd dreamed of, an online space for independent artists who couldn't afford fancy marketing or gallery connections. I built it on a borrowed laptop that wheezed when it loaded images. My kitchen table became an office, a studio, and a warehouse. Cardboard boxes filled the corners. The air smelled of coffee tape and determination. Every evening, I'd test layouts, upload photos, and delete them again, convinced I could make the world see what I saw: honest beauty, unpolished and real. 6 months later, the dream began to crack. My first launch failed before it even started. The site crashed, and the few orders that went through got lost in the mail. Suppliers backed out, shipping costs rose, and my account balance dropped low enough that the bank sent polite warnings. There were nights I sat on the floor surrounded by unsold inventory and thought about how easily my father's voice could fit inside my head. "I told you so," it whispered. Leaders don't sell trinkets online. I hated how familiar it sounded. I started bartending on weekends for extra cash. The work was loud, but it kept my lights on. That's where I met Alex Martinez, one of the line cooks who stayed late to help close. He had a calm way about him, the kind that made you feel seen without being studied. We'd sit at the bar after hours, splitting a leftover slice of pie, talking about everything and nothing. He didn't ask about my family. He asked about the business, instead what I wanted it to stand for, who I wanted it to help. It was the first time anyone cared about the idea without judging its size. One afternoon, during a lunch rush at the diner, a woman took the corner booth by the window. She wore a navy blazer and read from a stack of papers between bites of salad. When I refilled her coffee, she looked up, studying me for a moment longer than usual. "You run this place?" she asked. I laughed and shook my head. "Just serving the coffee, ma'am." She smiled, handed me her card, and said, "Call me sometime if you'd like a different kind of challenge. Name's Diana Cooper." I slipped the card into my apron pocket, unsure if she meant it. 2 weeks later, I found the card again under a pile of receipts. The edges were creased, but the number was still clear. I called. Diana answered with the confidence of someone who didn't waste time on small talk. She invited me to her office the next morning. When I arrived, she was already reviewing my printed business plan. "You've got the heart," she said, "but you need structure. Let's fix that." Over the next few months, she became my mentor, sharp, honest, never cruel. She taught me how to see failure as data, not defeat. Every critique stung at first, but it was the kind of pain that built muscle. Under her guidance, I rebuilt everything from the ground up. I learned how to negotiate with suppliers, manage inventory, and design a site that wouldn't crash under the first rush of traffic. The second launch didn't explode, it breathed. Orders trickled in steady and slow enough to keep me working without drowning. It wasn't success yet, but it was movement. Sometimes progress comes disguised as exhaustion. Even so, the nights stayed long. There were bills to juggle, emails to answer, and the constant ache of being invisible to the people who used to define my worth. I kept a small box on the shelf, old photos, my sister's note, a bracelet that caught the light when I turned it just right. It reminded me that I came from somewhere, even if that place no longer claimed me. One evening, after another 16-hour day, I broke my own rule and looked at my family's social media. There they were again, smiling at the Lakeside Country Club, my father holding an award, my mother shining beside him, Jessica poised at their side. I studied their faces until the screen blurred. They looked complete without me, a polished frame with no space for the missing picture. It hurt in a way that words couldn't soften, but it also hardened something inside me. If I could survive being erased, I could survive anything. The years that followed were a slow climb. By the end of the second year, my business finally made enough to cut down my hours at the diner. By the third, I left both jobs behind and rented a small office downtown. It smelled of new paint and old dreams. I hired 2 part-time assistants, Maya, a graphic designer with a laugh that filled the room, and Joseph, a college student who could make numbers behave. Together, we turned my once failing idea into something people began to recognize by name, Artisan Collective. Growth came in careful steps. I learned that success doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It creeps in through steady days and well-kept promises. My income stabilized, and the apartment I'd once cried in became too small. I moved into a 1-bedroom with real sunlight and a table that didn't wobble. The day I signed that lease, I caught my reflection in the glass door and barely recognized the woman standing there, older, steadier, not waiting for approval. Still, every milestone came with an echo. Sometimes, late at night, I'd pour a glass of wine and imagine what my parents would say if they knew. Would they be proud? Or would pride still depend on whether my success fit their version of respectability? I wanted to believe I didn't care, but the truth sat somewhere quieter than pride, more like longing disguised as resolve. As Artisan Collective grew, so did its reach. We began hosting workshops for local artists, teaching them how to sell their work online without losing their voice. Seeing their faces light up when their first orders came in gave me something I'd never found at those country club tables: purpose. The space buzzed with life paints, drying laughter echoing off high ceilings, coffee always brewing. It felt like community, a word I hadn't trusted in years. Diana remained my compass, appearing when decisions turned heavy. She taught me to invest, not just earn, to build safety instead of chasing more. With her help, I expanded into consulting, then small property investments. Each step brought security I never thought I'd touch. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was becoming what my parents had wanted: successful, stable, but on entirely different terms. The difference was that this life was built, not gifted. By my late 20s, the company was thriving. Investors called, offers came, and for the first time, I didn't feel small when I said no. The fear that used to trail me like a shadow began to fade. There was peace in independence, even when it was tiring. And yet, a piece of my past refused to stay quiet. One evening, Alex stopped by my office after closing. He leaned against the doorway, watching me pack up invoices. "You ever think about going back?" he asked. I looked up, startled. "Back where?" He shrugged. "Home, to see if they'd treat you any different now." I laughed softly, but it wasn't amusement. "They wouldn't recognize me," I said. "And that's probably the point." He didn't push. He just nodded, as if understanding that some roots are better left where they were planted. Months later, while reviewing potential partnerships, I stumbled across a business listing that froze me in place. Lakeside Country Club, financial distress, reduced membership, seeking buyer. The name alone stirred something I hadn't felt in years: curiosity mixed with caution. I told myself I was only reading out of interest, not sentiment. But the more I learned, the more the idea rooted itself in my mind. The place that had once been a symbol of exclusion was now vulnerable, waiting for someone to see value beyond reputation. I couldn't sleep that night. The rain returned, tapping the windows in the same rhythm as the night I'd left home. The irony was too perfect to ignore. Part of me whispered that it would be revenge to own the place they had used to humiliate me. Another voice, quieter but steadier, said it might be redemption, instead, not for them, but for me. By dawn, the decision had shaped itself. I called Diana first. She listened, then said, "If you're going to do it for the right reasons. Ownership is easy. Stewardship takes grace." Her words sat with me as I drafted an offer. I used a holding company, keeping my name hidden, and wrote the proposal with the same care I'd once used to pack those first fragile shipments. It wasn't about power anymore. It was about rewriting the story of the place that once told me I didn't belong. When Thomas Whitaker, the longtime owner, agreed to meet, I expected a shrewd businessman. Instead, I found a weary gentleman with kind eyes and a voice softened by years of trying to preserve something meaningful. He spoke about the club's history like it was a living thing, its members, its traditions, its decline. He wanted it to survive, not be torn down for profit. I promised him it would. That promise mattered more than the price. Weeks later, when I signed the final documents, the pen trembled in my hand. Outside the lawyer's office, the sun glinted off the hood of my car, the same way it used to reflect off the club's marble entrance. I sat behind the wheel and let the silence fill me. It wasn't triumph, I felt it was release. The girl who had once been told she didn't fit now held the keys to the place that had measured her worth. I didn't tell anyone right away. I wanted to keep the piece of it for myself, to let the meaning settle before the world touched it. I drove by the club one evening long after dark. The gates were closed, the windows dim, the air quiet except for the hum of crickets. I parked at the edge of the property and walked along the fence line, fingers grazing the cool metal. Beyond it, I could see the faint glow of the ballroom chandeliers. For a moment, I imagined the sound of my parents' laughter, the murmur of polite voices, the endless clinking of glasses. Then I turned away, letting the night fold around me like a curtain. The next day, I met with Martin Reynolds, the man I chose to manage the place. He was measured, thoughtful, and understood what legacy could mean without letting it suffocate progress. Together, we planned renovations outreach and new programs, ways to make the club not just exclusive but inclusive. It felt like laying new foundation over old earth, one careful brick at a time. By the time the first membership applications rolled in, I knew the hardest part wasn't buying the club. It was what came next, walking back into that ballroom, not as the outcast, but as the owner. That day was coming, and I could already feel the air shift, waiting for the moment when past and present would meet face to face. The first time I walked through the Lakeside Country Club as its new owner, the air carried the same scent I remembered from childhood, fresh polished lemon oil and quiet judgment. I arrived early before sunrise, when the mist still clung to the golf greens and the staff was just unlocking doors. For a moment, standing in the hallway outside the ballroom, I could almost hear echoes of the past. My mother's rehearsed laughter, my father's steady instructions on posture, the clink of glass against glass. The memories didn't hurt the way they used to. They simply passed through like weather that had finally run out of thunder. Martin met me at the entrance, a clipboard tucked under his arm, calm and ready as always. He reminded me of the kind of people who never needed to prove authority because it lived quietly in their presence. Together, we walked the grounds, checking repairs and reviewing schedules. I listened to him speak about the new memberships, the updated dining menus, and the upcoming anniversary gala that would mark 50 years since the club's founding. His voice held that blend of practicality and pride I'd come to admire. "We're expecting the old families to attend," he said as we stopped near the reflecting pond. "The Williamses are on the RSVP list, of course." I didn't answer right away. The early light mirrored the water's surface, soft and deceptive, hiding everything below. "Then I suppose it's time," I finally said. He nodded as if he had known this moment would come. There was no question in his eyes, only respect. The weeks leading to the gala were a blur of movement and quiet anticipation. Workers restored the ballroom's old oak floors. The chandeliers were cleaned until they glowed like captured sunlight, and the gardens were trimmed with precision. Every detail mattered, not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because this place deserved to be whole again. The country club had been built on the idea of exclusivity, but I was determined that its next chapter would mean something different: community, inclusion, dignity. I spent most of those days behind the scenes overseeing projects with Martin and finalizing preparations. To the members, I remained an unseen benefactor, a silent investor who had chosen to remain anonymous. Only Martin and my lawyer knew the truth. It was a strange kind of peace walking through the halls, unseen, knowing that the walls that once rejected me now answered to my name. As the gala approached, I found myself restless. Sleep became light, broken by images I didn't want to see. My father at the podium, my mother's practiced smile, Jessica's uncertain eyes. I wondered if they'd recognize me across a crowded room. 5 years wasn't long in their world, but it was enough to remake a life. The night of the gala arrived clear and still. The sunset had the same burnished gold I remembered from the evening I drove away from their house. I arrived an hour early, slipping in through the side entrance. Martin met me in my office, his tuxedo immaculate, his demeanor steady. "You sure about this?" he asked softly. "I've been sure for a long time," I said, though my hands trembled as I straightened the small silver clasp on my dress. He smiled. "Then I'll be right by you." The ballroom shimmered when I entered later that night. Golden light spilled from the chandeliers, catching the glassware and sequins, scattering reflections like confetti. Waiters moved between tables, carrying trays of champagne. Conversations rose and fell in waves, polite and predictable. I paused near the entrance, letting the moment settle around me. It was the same stage that had once held every humiliation of my youth, and now I walked into it by choice. From across the room, I saw my father standing near the head table, his hair now threaded with gray posture, as straight as ever. My mother beside him, elegant in emerald silk, her eyes scanning the crowd for familiar faces. Jessica stood a few steps away, radiant and composed, her hand resting lightly on her husband's arm. They looked like a portrait come to life, untouched by time. My pulse steadied as I crossed the room. People greeted me along the way, members I had met privately over the past year, who now saw me as one of them, unaware of the irony. I smiled, shook hands, and made small talk that meant nothing. My gaze stayed on the far end of the room. It was my mother who saw me first. Her smile froze, the kind of expression that cracks before it falls apart. She whispered something to my father, who turned, searching the crowd, until his eyes locked on mine. Recognition hit like a match struck in a dark room, bright, sudden, uncontrollable. He set his drink down too fast, the glass ringing against the table. I expected anger, maybe disbelief. What I didn't expect was how calm I felt when he started walking toward me. The years between us evaporated in a heartbeat, but so did the fear. "Tammy," he said, his voice low, careful, as if naming me could undo the shock. "What are you doing here?" Before I could answer, my mother appeared at his side, all social poise and polished control. "This is a private event," she said softly, but her tone carried a warning. Members and invited guests only. The surrounding chatter dimmed as heads began to turn. A hush rippled across the room, that quiet curiosity people can't hide when they sense something unraveling. I kept my voice even. I was invited. My father frowned. By whom? By the management, I said. His expression hardened. You don't belong here, Tammy. Not after the way you walked out on this family. I could feel every pair of eyes fixed on us. My mother's voice slipped between us, like silk drawn tight. Please, she said to a nearby server, fetch the manager. We seem to have a misunderstanding. Martin appeared before the request could travel far. He approached with the calm of a man who had rehearsed this moment in silence. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Williams, he said smoothly. Is there a problem? My father gestured toward me. Yes. This woman isn't a member and needs to be escorted out immediately. Martin's eyes met mine briefly, a question passing between us. I gave a small nod. He turned back to my father. There seems to be a small mistake, he said gently. Perhaps we should speak to the owner. I am speaking to you, my father snapped. Get the owner now. The room had gone completely still. The music faltered, the violins fading mid-note. Every sound seemed to wait for what came next. Martin's voice carried across the quiet. Mr. Williams, this is the owner. It took a moment for the words to land. My father blinked as if the sentence had been spoken in another language. My mother's hand tightened around her glass until her knuckles turned pale. Jessica gasped, her hand rising to her mouth. A murmur spread through the crowd like a slow tide. I stood where I was steady. It's true, I said. I purchased Lakeside last year. The silence that followed was almost tender. My father's face drained of color. My mother's composure shattered under the weight of 100 watching eyes. She tried to recover, reaching out as if to embrace me. Darling, what a surprise, she said, with a tremor that barely passed for warmth. You should have told us about this wonderful accomplishment. I stepped back before her hand could touch my arm. We haven't spoken in 5 years, I said quietly. When would I have told you? Her mouth opened, but no words came. My father's eyes narrowed, his voice dropping into the tone he once used to end arguments. How could you afford this? What kind of deal did you make? Before I could respond, an older member. Mr. Carson stepped forward. Richard, he said, half amused, half disbelieving. Your daughter's business was in the news last year. Artisan Collective, it sold for millions. My wife orders from them all the time. My father turned toward him, but the damage was done. Whispers rose again, soft and relentless. For once, he was the one under scrutiny. I felt something ease inside me, not triumph, but release. I nodded to Martin. Would you please escort my family to my office? We can speak privately there. He guided us through the corridor, past portraits of founders and donors, whose names I knew better than my own. My parents followed stiffly, Jessica trailing behind, silent and pale. Every few steps, members stepped aside to let us pass, some with polite nods, others openly curious. The air felt different now, charged, uncertain. In my office, the quiet returned. The space had been redone since I bought the club Modern Line's warm light art from Artisan Collective artists on the walls. My father scanned it all as if cataloging an exhibit. My mother perched on the edge of a chair, her handbag clutched like a shield. Jessica chose the seat farthest from them, her eyes on the view of the golf course beyond the window. I stayed standing. I didn't plan for this reunion, I said, but I suppose life has its timing. My father crossed his arms. You've made your point, he said sharply. Humiliated us in front of half the town. Are you satisfied I didn't humiliate you? I said calmly. You did that when you assumed I didn't belong. For a moment, no one spoke. The clock on the wall ticked softly. My mother broke the silence, first voice dripping with practiced sympathy. You left us, Tammy. We only wanted what was best for you. I looked at the woman who had taught me to smile through discomfort. You wanted what was best for you, I said. You wanted a daughter who fit neatly into your world. Jessica's voice came quietly from the far chair. I tried to call you, she said. The first year a few times. Your number had changed. Her words cut through the air like a small, unexpected light. I turned toward her. I didn't know, I said softly. She nodded. I ordered from your store a couple of times. I thought maybe you'd notice my name. For the first time that night, I smiled. Maybe that was your way of saying you still cared. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't look away. My mother, uncomfortable with any crack in the facade, straightened. Well, water under the bridge. We're a family again now, and that's what matters. I shook my head. No, Mother. We're not a family again. You're welcome here as members, but not as my parents. That part ended the day you disowned me. The words landed softly, but stayed in the room like smoke. My father stiffened. My mother's mouth fell open, and Jessica lowered her gaze, tears slipping silently down her cheek. It wasn't revenge that filled me then. It was peace, the kind that comes when the truth finally takes its rightful place. Outside the window, the evening lights shimmered over the lawns. Inside, no one moved. The past had finally met the present, and there was nothing left to hide behind. I turned toward the door, signaling to Martin that our conversation was done. You can stay for the rest of the event, I said quietly. Or you can leave. Either way, the club will continue without you. As I stepped into the hallway, the sounds of the gala swelled again, music, laughter, life carrying on. The night air brushed cool against my skin, grounding me in the moment. Behind me, I heard my sister's voice, soft and unsteady. Tam, wait. I paused, but didn't turn. Can we talk later? She asked. Just us. I nodded once and walked toward the ballroom lights, leaving the door open behind me. The night was far from over, but something inside me had already settled. The story that had begun with rejection was finally ready to turn toward what came next. When Jessica found me in the hallway later that night, the music from the ballroom had softened into background murmurs, and the air carried the faint scent of champagne and lilies. She looked smaller than I remembered, her shoulders drawn inward, her voice quiet enough to get lost between songs. Can we talk? She asked. I nodded and led her down a side corridor toward the small conference room adjoining my office. The room was dim, except for a single lamp on the sideboard. It felt private, untouched by the noise outside. Jessica closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment, as if gathering courage. You look good, she said, then gave a faint smile. Different, but good. So do you? I answered, studying her face. Maybe a little tired. She laughed softly. 3 kids under 5 will do that. The number caught me off guard. 3 twins and a daughter, she said, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. The youngest just turned 2. She hesitated, eyes fixed on the carpet. I named her Tamara. We call her Tammy. The words struck deeper than she could have known. For a moment, the sound of my name in her voice felt like something being returned to me that I didn't realize I'd lost. I looked away, trying to steady myself. She's got your stubborn chin, Jessica added, a shy pride in her voice. And your eyes. I smiled then, small but real. I'd like to meet her someday. You will, She sat across from me, folding her hands in her lap. I need to say something before I lose my nerve. I should have stood up for you when they gave you that ultimatum. I knew it was wrong, but I was scared. I didn't want to lose everything, too. Her honesty was quiet, not rehearsed. I believed her. I understand, I said. We survive the way we know how. Jessica nodded, eyes glistening. But surviving isn't the same as living. Watching you tonight, it hit me. You looked free. Even with Dad glaring holes through the air, you looked like someone who belongs to herself. The comment lingered between us. I let it settle before speaking. It wasn't easy getting here. I know, she said. That's why I want things to be different. For me, for my kids. I don't want them to think approval is love. Her words carried a truth I'd waited years to hear from anyone in that family. Then change it, I said gently. You can start now. Jessica's smile was small, but it reached her eyes. Would you have coffee with me sometime? Maybe meet the kids? I'd like that, I said, and I meant it. When we returned to the office, our parents were standing near the door, the weight of unspoken words hanging in the air. My mother's voice was brittle with forced cheerfulness. Everything good, girls? Jessica only nodded. I moved behind my desk, signaling the conversation was over. I should get back to the gala, I said, and you should rejoin your friends. People will be wondering. My father's concern was immediate and predictable. What do we tell them? Whatever you like, I replied. By tomorrow morning, everyone will know I own the club, so I suggest you get comfortable with that truth. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. For a moment, we stood there, the four of us caught in the strange stillness of people realizing the story had shifted, and there was no going back. Jessica lingered a second longer. I'll call you tomorrow, she said quietly, then turned to follow them out. My mother was already reassembling her smile, no doubt crafting the version of the evening she'd tell by morning. After they left, I stayed in the office, letting the silence breathe around me. The hum of conversation drifted faintly from the ballroom, muffled by distance. For the first time that night, I felt tired, not from confrontation, but from the release of holding myself so still for so long. The next weeks unfolded like slow ripples from a stone dropped in water. Word of the ownership spread through the club community with an energy I hadn't anticipated. Some members approached me with polite congratulations, others with cautious curiosity. I could see it in their faces, the quick recalculations of status and perception. It no longer unnerved me. I'd lived too many years being misunderstood to be shaken by whispers. My father adjusted in the only way he knew how, by pretending nothing had changed. When our paths crossed at committee meetings, he was professional, polite, and distant, as if addressing a rival developer instead of his daughter. My mother made several attempts to smooth the narrative. Invitations arrived in cream envelopes embossed and perfumed for Sunday brunches or holiday dinners. I declined them all with the same measured politeness she had once used to dismiss me. Jessica, true to her word, called that next morning. Her voice carried both relief and uncertainty, like someone stepping onto new ground. We met at a quiet cafe downtown, the kind of place that smelled of fresh bread and safety. She arrived early, dressed simply in jeans and a cream sweater, without the polished armor of our childhood world. We talked for hours about her kids, about work, about everything except the wound that brought us there. When she finally showed me photos of little Tamara, my chest ached in a way that felt both painful and whole. After that, our meetings became a rhythm once a week, at first, then more often. She began showing me pictures she'd taken on her phone, small slices of life. The twins chasing each other through sprinklers, her daughter painting with more color than paper. One afternoon, she mentioned she'd signed up for a photography class at the community center. I always admired that you followed what you loved, she said, stirring her coffee. I thought maybe it's time I learned how to see too. The pride in her voice was quiet, but unmistakable. I told her I'd help her pick a camera when she was ready. It was a small thing, but it felt like the beginning of repair, slow, fragile, and real. At the club, life carried on. Membership climbed, events filled the calendar, and the air of exclusivity softened into something more human. Martin became not just a manager, but a trusted partner. He handled the old guard members with grace and welcomed new families who had once assumed they'd never be allowed through the doors. Watching the place thrive under those changes reminded me that success didn't need applause, it just needed meaning. Diana visited often, usually on quiet weekday afternoons when the greens were empty. We'd walk the grounds talking about new ventures, about life, about the odd symmetry of how everything had come full circle. She never treated me like a triumph. She treated me like a student still learning, which was exactly what I needed. Alex continued running the foundation we'd started together, helping young entrepreneurs find their footing when family or circumstance left them stranded. He kept a desk at the club's community wing, a space we'd built for outreach programs. Whenever I stopped by, he'd grin and say, "You realize you've turned the most exclusive club in town into a neighborhood center?" I'd shrug. Maybe that's what it was meant to be. As months passed, Jessica's visits grew more frequent. She brought her kids one Saturday afternoon, parking discreetly near the back to avoid our parents' friends. The twins ran circles around the fountain laughing, while little Tamara followed, clutching a plush rabbit by the ear. She stopped in front of me, looking up with serious eyes, so like my own, and said, "Are you Aunt Tammy?" I knelt beside her and nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, I am." She smiled, satisfied, and handed me the rabbit as if it sealed the agreement. I held it, gently overwhelmed by how something so small could carry so much forgiveness. As the days turned into seasons, the weight of old anger loosened its hold. My parents remained part of the landscape, distant, careful, their presence formal rather than familial. Occasionally, I'd see them at a club event. My father would nod in acknowledgement, my mother would offer a smile too polished to be real. It no longer hurt. They had become what they were always meant to be, people I once knew well, who shaped me by what they could not give. One evening, exactly a year after the gala, we hosted a staff appreciation dinner under the stars. Long tables stretched across the patio, candles flickering in glass holders, laughter spilling into the warm night. I stood at the microphone, thanking everyone who had built the place back up from the inside out. When I looked out at the crowd, I caught sight of my parents sitting near the back. I hadn't invited them, but as members, they were welcome to attend. My mother was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read, somewhere between pride and regret. My father was listening too, his jaw set, his gaze thoughtful. When I spoke about community and purpose, about the beauty of second chances, he nodded once. A gesture so subtle, most people would have missed it. I didn't. Later, as the night wound down and the last guests drifted away, I walked the quiet grounds alone. The moon hung low over the lake, its reflection trembling against the water. I thought about the girl I had been, the one who left home with nothing but determination and a few boxes in her car. I thought about the woman who had walked back through these same doors to face the ghosts of her past. The truth settled in gently. The story was never about proving them wrong. It was about finding peace without their permission. The country club that once defined my unworthiness had become the place where I built something new, not out of revenge, but out of understanding. I looked toward the clubhouse lights glowing softly in the windows and felt something close to gratitude. Not for the pain, but for the strength it forced me to find. Tomorrow would come with its meetings, its plans, its ordinary hours. But tonight, standing beneath the quiet sky, I let myself rest in the rare stillness of knowing that I was finally whole. And somewhere in the distance, faint but certain, I could hear laughter, the sound of my sister calling her children home. Morning came softly the next day, as if the whole town had decided to breathe again. I woke before the sun, the lake still silver and smooth beyond the window. The air held that early kind of stillness, where even the birds seemed reluctant to stir. For the first time in years, I felt no need to brace myself for what the day might hold. The storm had passed. The sky, though pale, belonged to me. I made coffee and sat by the wide window in my office, watching the first light touch the water. A few club workers were already out on the course, tiny figures moving through the mist, their laughter faint and familiar. Life had continued quietly after the gala, but something fundamental had changed. The tension that used to live in my shoulders had loosened like a knot that finally gave way. The Williams name still appeared on the membership board downstairs, carved in neat black letters among the founders and patrons. It no longer made my chest tighten. It was history, and history didn't need erasing to lose its power. It just needed context. When I saw my father now, it was mostly in passing meetings about property use, financial planning, the small matters that kept the club running. He treated me with formal politeness, the same tone he once reserved for investors he couldn't afford to offend. It wasn't love, but it was respect, and that was enough. The edge in his voice had dulled over time, replaced by something like recognition. My mother came around more often, always well-dressed, always smiling too brightly. She still spoke in careful sentences, as though words could glue over cracks she refused to name. But sometimes, in quiet moments, I'd catch her looking at me, not as the daughter who defied her, but as the woman she might have been if she'd allowed herself more courage. She never apologized directly, and I never asked her to. Some truths are better left as silent understandings. Jessica and I, though our story kept growing. Each week, we found new pieces of one another we hadn't known were missing. She'd come to the club during my off hours, bringing her camera and her kids. The twins had a fascination with the golf carts, and little Tamara had taken to following me around like a shadow. She liked sitting at my desk, scribbling on notepads with a pink crayon, announcing she was helping Aunt Tammy work. Sometimes I'd look up from my paperwork and catch Jessica watching her daughter, eyes soft pride, mixed with something heavier, maybe regret, maybe hope. She'd whisper, "I just want her to grow up, knowing she's enough." And I'd smile, because that was the only inheritance that mattered. As the months folded into a year, I found a rhythm that felt like peace. I spent mornings reviewing plans with Martin, and afternoons meeting with artists whose work now filled the club's hallways. What had once been a fortress of exclusivity was now a place of color and community. Teenagers volunteered on weekends. Veterans from the local shelter helped maintain the grounds. Laughter echoed through spaces that had once felt cold. Sometimes, when I walked through the dining room at dusk, I could feel the club's old ghosts settle content that it was finally serving the living. Diana visited one afternoon in early spring. She arrived without warning, carrying a small box wrapped in brown paper. "A little something for the wall," she said, handing it to me. Inside was a framed photograph, one she had taken the day my first business office opened. It was of my hands holding a cracked ceramic mug filled with coffee. The caption beneath read, "Start where you stand." I hung it above the door. Every time I passed beneath it, I felt grounded again, reminded that beginnings aren't grand. They're quiet, fragile, and often unseen. Later that week, Alex organized a charity dinner for the foundation. The ballroom gleamed under candlelight, filled with laughter and quiet pride. Near the end of the night, he raised a toast in my direction, calling me the stubborn heart that built the bridge we're all standing on. I laughed, shaking my head, but his words stayed with me. It was true I had built a bridge, not back to the past, but forward to something entirely my own. When my father approached me afterward, I expected the usual formalities. Instead, he offered his hand. "You've done well," he said simply. The sentence was short, unadorned, but it was the closest thing to an apology he knew how to give. I took his hand, shook it once, and let it go. That was all either of us needed. After the event ended, I found myself standing on the balcony, the night air cool and steady. Below the lake reflected the ballroom's golden light. Jessica came to stand beside me, arms crossed, smiling faintly. "You ever think about selling it?" she asked, nodding toward the club. "No," I said after a moment. "It's not just a business anymore. It's a place that reminds me where I came from and how far I've gone." She looked at me for a long moment, then said softly, "You know, for what it's worth, Dad talks about you differently now. He brags, actually." I laughed quietly. "I'll believe that when I hear it." "I'm serious," she said, nudging me with her elbow. "He tells people you've built something worth more than any development he ever made." I didn't answer right away. The sound of frogs carried across the water, and the night breeze lifted strands of hair from my face. "Maybe he's finally learning what value really means," I said. Jessica's phone buzzed, and I could see a photo of her kids flash across the screen. "I should get home," she said. "The twins think bedtime is a negotiation now." I smiled. "Bring them by this weekend. We'll let them drive the carts again." She grinned. "You just made their whole week." When she left, I stayed on the balcony, letting the quiet wash over me. The moon hung low, silvering the tops of the trees. I thought of all the versions of myself that had stood in this place, the girl who wanted to be seen, the woman who needed to prove she could survive, and the person I had finally become, someone who no longer needed either. In the distance, I could hear the faint hum of a sprinkler turning on the rustle of leaves, the soft rhythm of a world still moving forward. The peace I felt wasn't the loud kind that came from victory. It was the kind that settled into your bones when you stopped fighting the wrong battles. The kind that taught you that walking away can be an act of love for yourself and sometimes for them too. These days, I start my mornings with slow coffee and sunlight the way Diana once taught me. I walk the club grounds before the first members arrive, watching the dew lift from the grass. The silence there isn't lonely anymore. It's full alive with second chances and the quiet grace of everything that continues after breaking. I've learned that some wounds don't close because someone apologizes. They close because you finally stop reopening them to see if they've healed. Peace isn't given. It's chosen moment by moment until it becomes part of you. So, if you've ever walked away from people who couldn't see your worth, know that it's not the end of love. It's the beginning of your own. If this story found something true in you, tell me where you're listening from down in the comments. I'd love to hear your story too. And if you believe that peace is the quietest kind of strength, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more stories about finding it one hard, beautiful step at a time.